In May of 1995, almost exactly 29 years ago to this day, the final chapter of Dragon Ball's manga by Akira Toriyama was released to the world. A grand tale told over the course of 11 years that has gone on to completely define the life of Akira Toriyama himself. But once Dragon Ball was over, once the final Genki Dama had been thrown, the final villain vanquished, and the final goodbye from Son Goku penned, Toriyama suddenly had time to ask himself a very important question. What's next? With Dragon Ball having established itself as one of the most popular and profitable manga to have ever been created, he was free to now do pretty much anything he pleased, but what was there left to do after something like Dragon Ball? Ultimately, over the course of the next 5 years, Toriyama would explore the answer to that very question, experimenting with a series of one-shots interspersed with 3 short, one-volume stories. The first 2 of those remain pretty niche to this day, but the final of the 3 was a little-known story that provides a window into Toriyama's soul itself. A story he himself went on to describe as a work that poured everything of who he was at the time into it, which he intended to be one last hurrah. I'm totally not Mark, and this is Sandland. At only 14 chapters in length, Sandland is but a small drop in the sea of Akira Toriyama's life's work. And yet between 2023 and 2024, this story has seen its presence expanded far beyond its original scope. Originally adapted into a movie, Sandland then saw itself expanded into a TV series containing a sequel, and finally, a 30-hour expansive video game. For this video, I have personally gone through every single one of them, all but the video game anyway, from beginning to end, completely immersing myself in its world for the last few weeks to really understand this story. Now that's a lot of sand. So, first up, let's dive into the original, the source material, the manga. But with a bunch of anime clips for the sake of my editor's sanity. I had actually read Sandland long ago, but honestly it had been so insanely long since I read it last that it legitimately may as well have been my very first time reading now. And having read it with essentially fresh eyes, not only is this story itself wonderfully charming, but it hides within it an incredible amount of insight into Toriyama as a person and artist. The entire manga, as I mentioned before, is remarkably short. At a measly 14 chapters, there is only so much story that can be told within such a short time frame. But despite that, Toriyama manages to zoom in and write a genuinely compelling character piece that wholly sells its characters and world in an instant. Now here's the thing. The world of Sandland is small, like really small. It's the sort of story much like a small rural town where most everyone knows everyone and a single person can really make a big difference, where the adventure of an entire story can take place in a single road trip. And that small scope is not just a product of how short the manga is, though it certainly is one of the key reasons the story works at such a tiny length. Rather, it is a conscious decision from Toriyama himself, the answer to that question of what next? You see, in an interview, Toriyama laid out the answer he arrived at, saying the following. Dragon Ball was a bit flashy, so as a reaction against that, for my shorts and one-shots, I drew uneventful, plain, peaceful stories set in small worlds with low-key heroes. That's what I like. Looking back now, it's honestly interesting to contemplate the sorts of stories Toriyama most loved to tell. We obviously know that Dragon Ball eventually, through both popular and editorial demand, became a huge sprawling action manga. But at its genesis, it was ultimately a comedy adventure manga, with Goku and Bulma exploring the world and bringing out laughs in every little encounter they came across. And so, with all the creative freedom in the world, hot off the monumentous space opera that was Dragon Ball, Toriyama returned to the small, quaint stories he most loved to tell. And I think Sandland is maybe the most potent example of that very approach. At its helm are a whopping 3 characters total. Beelzebub, a demon prince who so desperately wants to be seen as evil, but whose idea of bad extends to not brushing his teeth before bed. Then there's Thief, the old demon codger whose cowardly nature stands in direct contrast to his brave actions. And finally, there's Rao, the grizzled human sheriff whose desire to do the right thing masks a past colored with strife. This trio is Sandland. While there are other small characters like the swimmers, the bold General Are, and the villainous Commander Zeo, it's the interplay between the trio that propels this story, one that is likewise similarly small. Every single narrative beat could probably be summarized in a single paragraph. Here, I bet I can do it in less. Okay, so spoiler alert for anyone that hasn't read it, though if you haven't, what are you doing here? Go read it. It's like 14 chapters, don't be lazy. In an arid wasteland left dry from natural disasters and war, a human teams up with demons to look for a hidden lake. Along the way, they face trouble from the desert natives, but through revelations of self-discovery, a stolen tank, and some friends they meet along the way, they manage to not only find the lake, but overthrow the corrupt government and set loose a river to restore water to the region. Boom! Done. That really is the vast majority of what happens in Sandland, but here's the thing. Sandland is not about the plot beats. Sandland is about a single character. Yeah, no, not the one you've seen plastered all over the promotional material, not him, no. Sandland is about Sheriff Rao. This is his story, and Toriyama takes the reader through themes of fate, the sins of the past, and the path of atonement. It's a story with remarkable nuance and not something I really expected from Mr. Akira poop-on-a-stick Toriyama. It's all wrapped up in a central conflict that is surprisingly overtly political, directly dealing with themes of propaganda, political power, war, and genocide. And yet, in spite of that, this story is predominantly a comedy. Toriyama, in all his mad genius, takes themes like this and makes the story genuinely hilarious without undercutting the emotional power of what he wants to say here. I mean, in the first chapter, he has the most hilarious hard cut from Thief's irreverent announcement of Slime's death to his eyeballs and evaporated body just lying there in the sand. You know you're in for a good time when you're dying laughing at the starting line. But in between the jokes and evocative scenery, the themes that lie underneath are indeed a lot more mature and political than I'd come to have expected from Toriyama. Earlier in the story, it's revealed that Rao was once in the king's army and led a genocide on a race of people called the Pichi, who were presented as terrorists. He wiped them out and in the explosion lost everything. His wife, his troops, his possessions. He stepped away from the army, and throughout his life, it's revealed that this genocide he took part in was nothing but a ruse, founded on a lie created by the government. The Pichi were actually developing a way to produce water, and the powers that be didn't want their artificial scarcity undone, harming their money-making schemes. It's a core foundation of Sandland that immediately instills an overwhelming sense of weight to this otherwise light-hearted tale. And Toriyama draws these scenes in such subtle, understated ways that truly force readers to ruminate on the gravitas of what's being unveiled. The art as a whole is unsurprisingly a real high point for this manga, and it's unique in that it's drawn by Akira Toriyama himself entirely alone. No assistance for help with backgrounds or inking in blacks. And well, he did go on record saying it did end up being a bit too much for him, resulting in a whole lot of stress and crunch time. But the results honestly speak for themselves, and it's great to see a master at the top of his game here. Spectacular paneling, great clean line work, stunning vehicles, beautiful environments. The list honestly could go on forever. His work even evolved to include screen tones, and the color pages feature his now iconic approach to rendering. It's truly wonderful and goes a long way in studying the nuances of this tale. However, despite all of the political themes and tragic pasts and world famines, what I find most compelling about Sandland is what it does with the frankly depressing world. I would go so far as to say that one of the core tenets of Dragon Ball is its infinite, unwavering optimism. Sure, there are depressing scenes of death, heartbreak, and drama all throughout Dragon Ball's story, but throughout it all, that feeling of optimism is ever present. There is no situation too dire, no pinch too tight that will stop Goku from marching in headfirst, confident that he'll find a way. Nothing that can stop the world of Dragon Ball from saying it'll be okay in the end. Through characters like Goku and everyone around him, that eternal optimism is honestly unstoppable. But throughout the first half of Sandland, things feel very different. In this more grounded world, there is no turning Super Saiyan and making everything right again. No Dragon Balls to revive an ethnically cleansed race. The sins of the past are decades removed at this point, so once again, what now? The most wonderful and compelling part of Sandland, to me, is the answer to that very question. And the answer arrived at is, despite all odds, an unwavering sense of optimism. In the end, rather than wallow in the state of the world as it currently exists, Ra, Beelzebub, everyone around them march forward, with their hearts set not on the past, but the possibilities of a brighter future. Ra doesn't spend chapters processing the revelation of the Peachy people. He wakes up and drives full speed to make things right the best he can. When met with resistance, he and Beelzebub overcome any obstacles, and through their genuine soul and optimism, win over the hearts of those they meet along the way. Even when Ra's genocidal past is revealed, everyone around him takes it in immediate stride because they see clearly how Ra was misled. Even though there are no magical Dragon Balls to right Ra's wrongs, or any mystical way to free the world of Sandland from its barren, lifeless world of famine and poverty, every good-hearted person involved in this story simply marches forward, doing the best they can. That sense of never-ending optimism that permeated Dragon Ball is not gone here. This time, rather than raw strength or transformations, the optimism is the weapon of this story, and I find that deeply moving. Ultimately, it is not the individual plot beats that make up the 14-chapter story of Sandland, but its characters and themes. While the tank action sequences and Beelzebub beating up people are absolutely great fun, what you will remember after reading Sandland is its exploration of Ra as a character and the questions it poses of the world around us. As the crew discover General Zeo's lake, artificially dammed up for decades to induce scarcity, its demolition is euphoric not because bad guys were beat up along the way, but because you know that as long as good people exist in the world of Sandland, everything is going to be okay. Next to Kawa, Toriyama described Sandland as his favorite work, and well, it's honestly easy to see why. Yet now the responsibility to share this magnificent story falls to another. 23 years later, following the dam bursting across the pages of that very manga, a CG movie adaptation was announced to be made by a trio collaboration of Gundam Legend Sunrise, Kamikaze Doga known for the CG JoJo openings, and Anima, a prominent Japanese CG support studio that Bandai recently invested in. A pretty significant collaboration and one I was very interested to see the results of. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Sandland, the movie. As is the case with any movie adaptation of an existing work of fiction, I went into this looking to see how well executed it is not only as an adaptation, but in its own right. Did the jokes land right? Are the characters and environment designs faithful? In what ways does it use its medium to elevate the source material? Is it even a good movie on its own? And thankfully, I'm honestly glad to say that the Sandland movie largely delivers on most all of those fronts. With few exceptions, Sandland is remarkably faithful to the original. Scene by scene, line by line, every moment and joke is mostly kept perfectly intact. By pulling in Dragon Ball Z veteran Toshiyuki Kano to do the character designs, the 3D models all look exceptionally faithful to Toriyama's style in the original manga, replicating iconic panels rather well. In fact, outside of one noteworthy exception, the only major scenes wholly new to the movie are two at the very beginning. One added audition scene that actually genuinely rules, helping to not only flesh out some of the demons a bit, but deliver even more genuine laughs, and another that shows Rao being a community-focused sheriff for a bit prior to leaving. Both very solid additions that do wonders in giving us some extra time to grow acquainted with these characters before they set off on their journey. Most of the other additions or minor changes are bolstering jokes and action sequences, and really, the only noteworthy miss is the aforementioned scene of Slime dying, which for some reason was changed to him only almost dying? No killing slimes in current year apparently. I think where Sandland really comes to life, however, is in its cast. This is truly an all-star cast, and you will almost certainly know these voices. Even if you don't recognize the names, good old Beelzebub is voiced by Kobayashi from Dragon Maid. Rao is Hit from Dragon Ball Super. Thief is Brook from One Piece. Satan is goddamn Solid Snake. What? The list honestly does go on, but everyone in this cast is top tier goodness and brings the cast to life in a way that matches exactly what I heard in my head when reading the manga. Though one thing did stick out to me, and that's the English translation. For some reason, some of the names and terms are seemingly censored for English speakers. The term demon is almost completely avoided, only being used in explicit cases where the Japanese word ma is used. Beelzebub, the demon prince, becomes Beelzebub, the fiend prince. Satan, the demon king, is also similarly changed to Lucifer, the fiend king. None of these are, like, world-ending deal breakers for me or anything, but it does seem weird to still be afraid of the word Satan these days. Maybe it's a Disney thing given its release on Hulu, or maybe it's a Bandai thing as the Dragon Quest anime kept changing demon to dark. I don't know, but I wanted to point it out either way.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
In spite of some great-looking 3D character models and cool action sequences, I do think the visuals of this movie are probably its weakest aspect. In particular, the storyboard just kind of feels okay at best, with its worst moments commonly reducing the scale of certain scenes. When it comes to translating a story between two mediums, it's important to ensure you pay attention to the strengths of the medium you're creating for. In manga adaptations, this often means not just pasting panels one-to-one for your layouts, instead reserving those for powerful, impactful moments. Otherwise, you run the risk of creating something quite dull and not suited to the animated medium. Sandland's storyboard is aware of this and does make efforts here and there to produce some unique framing of its own, but it's all very cramped and confined. Now that might sound appropriate given the emphasis on Sandland being a small story in a small world, but even when it does copy Toriyama one-to-one, it seriously just nukes the scale of the original intent. Sprawling vistas and environments like these are crunched down to a fraction of their original scale, and really doesn't quite do service to the environment that Toriyama toiled over. There's also some fairly glaring technical issues in spots. While close-ups look excellent and refined, any sort of long shot sees pretty intense aliasing appear on the character models. I don't know if this is a case of a bad scaling algorithm used to size and place these characters against backgrounds, or if this stair-stepping is caused by genuinely poor anti-aliasing, but it really creates some jarring dissonance between the models and the painted backgrounds. Honestly, this part probably distracted me more than the bland storyboard, to the point that I just had to train myself to not think about it. In spite of those issues, I certainly don't think this is a bad looking movie at all. And given there are some genuinely neat moments of direction and cool action scenes, I imagine these thoughts may not be a unanimous complaint either. I think I just expected a little more polish given how strong some of those JoJo CG sequences were back in the day. Amusingly, the other JoJo aspect this movie shares outside of its studio is its composer. Yugo Kanno helms the music here, and although it's purposely understated and minimal composition may not have the biggest wow factor, I did find that it fit pretty well at least. If the movie is basically a one-to-one, almost perfectly faithful recreation of the manga, with great acting, mostly faithful visuals, and solid music, what is there to even talk about? Well, that's where that noteworthy exception I mentioned earlier comes into play. Well, that's certainly a departure from how faithful everything had been up until now, isn't it? Interestingly, the Sandland movie chooses to noticeably rework the climax of the story, making things a lot larger in scale. Where the original manga sees Zeo helicopter in a single bugman and get almost immediately shot down by Ade, in the movie, everything is bigger. Zeo shows up with a giant floating fortress and unleashes not one, but an entire army of bugmen. And look, I totally get it, right? It's not hard to see why this decision was made. Sandland's manga climax is incredibly low-key, and I don't exactly think that would have played all too well on the big screen after all that build-up and you're sat there trying not to have a meltdown over handing over half of your savings account for a half gram of popcorn. From an entertainment perspective, these changes are hugely successful. The rising tension across the various perspectives is great, and one of the most amazing additions comes from a showdown between Rao and Zeo, the man who ordered him to unwittingly commit genocide. It has a real heroic Western vibe to it that I think fits Sandland and the character of Rao remarkably well. However, from a thematic perspective, I think these changes are only half successful. On one hand, they alter the focus of the finale to be primarily on Rao and Zeo, which is the heart of the story and infinitely more interesting than Beelzebub's 1v1 against an insect man that just kinda comes out of nowhere. I'm honestly a big fan of this change. But on the other hand, there's a lot of nuance that may be lost along the way. Beelzebub is pitted against an army of bugmen that all manage to feel less threatening as a mob than a single entity. And more importantly, Zeo's fate is completely altered, having him be spared by Rao and then sent flying off alive in the distance, Team Rocket style. Beelzebub, who has less ties to Zeo than anyone else in the story, gets the final KO hit on Zeo in the end. When it's all said and done though, I do think the changes to this movie's ending are absolutely a net positive, even if some of the original is lost. It's still a satisfying conclusion and the majority of the core thematic resolutions remain in place. General Are still gets to contribute, and Rao's Wild West showdown is a wonderful capper to his crusade across the sands, allowing him to rally the hearts of the ignorant troops before Zeo is gone. His decision to spare Zeo is a pretty drastic change as well, but I think it once again plays into the existing theme of optimism for future change very well. If they were going to change the climax of this movie, which I do think they were right to do, then I'm mostly glad they did it this way. On the whole, Sandland is a pretty wonderfully faithful recreation of the manga, elevated by its cast and serving as a great alternative for those who prefer anime over manga. And while sometimes that faithfulness doesn't quite elevate or deliver one-to-one, it's still an enjoyable time nevertheless. And you know what? I'm fine with that. But while the manga may end here, this movie version of events is but episode 6 of the anime. That's right, an anime. Following the release of this film's adaptation in Japan, a whole series was announced. Not only would it retell the movie with small expansions on the story, but it would also follow up with a sequel, Forest Land, complete with all kinds of cool contributions from Mr. Akira Toriyama himself. And how did that turn out? Well, let's take a step into Forest Land and find out. If there's one thing this anime entirely justifies its existence for, it's that opening. Straight on the never skip list it goes, 11 out of 10, no further questions, thank you. It's strange to think that after almost 25 years of dormancy, a manga like Sandland would suddenly find itself with a sequel. Initially dreamt up by the anime staff, Toriyama jumped in to provide designs, characters, and suggestions for various episodes here and there. And the results are pretty damn interesting to say the least. This new arc centers largely around two new main characters. Muniel, a stubborn angel who decides to wreak havoc on Earth because he's a bored little baby who doesn't want to do any work, and Anne, a headstrong mechanical engineer and secret princess from the previous unknown region of Forest Land. From the get-go, this anime arc makes a very strong impression, with the very first episode featuring fantastic pacing, character interactions, and legitimately funny jokes. The gag of Muniel's pitiful, wimpy lightning zaps absolutely destroyed me.
Oi, Kisama, motto kochi e koi. Ha? Nande ikanaki ikenai n da yo? Dakara waza ga todokanai n da yo!
There's likewise a pretty big jump in visual quality with the transition to this anime's arc. While the movie was of course restrained to a single director's vision, this anime exclusive arc has many different directors on board, and they sure seem to do a much better job with creating awesome layouts. There's also a pretty big uptick in traditional 2D animation interspersed between the 3D stuff. Where the movie mostly reserved 2D work for effects or momentary side characters where it didn't make sense to model them, the anime uses it pretty indiscriminately on just about everyone. Even the main characters end up 2D at times. It doesn't all look particularly great or even like Toriyama at times, but it's a refreshing mix-up to the visuals either way. By the end of the first episode, the central conflict is already unfolding. Anne is from the titular Forest Land, a previously secret land beyond the dam that recently undergone a government coup. That newly installed government, led by the fallen angel Muniel and his military cooperator, General Bread, aims to use Peachy technology and aquanium, the magical mineral used in the genocidal explosion of the Peachy people, to conquer the world. The premise itself is pretty simple, but the beat-to-beat details are definitely more grand in spectacle than the original manga was. With an expanding cast of characters and stakes that ramp up very drastically, the vibes here are not entirely the same, but that's not necessarily a bad thing either. Following up a one-volume story with such a specific vision can be tough as you try to strike a balance of old and new. It's a task I don't envy, that's for sure. Unfortunately though, the execution of that task begins to fall apart rather quickly. While the first episode of the arc is genuinely good, each subsequent episode finds ways to fall flat. The gang enters Forest Land in an attempt to save the soon-to-be executed former king, but weirdly, every part of that rescue attempt nukes the initially great pacing, and twists are seen from a mile away. Bizarrely, action sequences bring the rest of the world to a halt, causing the execution that is definitely happening in like 5 seconds to completely freeze while Beelzebub and Muniel fight for half an episode. But who knows? Perhaps that was simply a 1000 IQ calculated galaxy brain reference to Goku vs. Frieza and not at all unintentional. Anne is revealed to be of demon heritage, much like her mother the Queen, and it turns out she's actually the long-forgotten sister of Beelzebub. But while this seems like a neat new plot point that adds some level of nuance to Anne's past and relationship with Beelzebub, it is never really explored like at all after its introduction. General Bread, the only antagonist of this arc, is given an even smaller amount of actual substance and backstory. By the end of the 7-episode arc, I think I genuinely was more emotionally compelled by Mr. Dead Slime than I was by him. Honestly, I was left baffled why he even existed in the first place, rather than having Muniel as the sole antagonist, and I think this might be a result of Toriyama's interjection. You see, Muniel and his backstory were a Toriyama contribution after the initial Forestland outline was created by the anime staff, making Bread a part of that original plot. I think this strange misguided focus comes about because the team weren't quite committed enough to letting go of Bread as the villain. And so the two characters ended up fighting with one another, metaphorically speaking, for focus, and both ended up half-baked as a result. Now I know it might all sound like this entire anime arc is all doom and gloom, but I do want to be clear that that's not really the case. While the plot might not all come together, there are a plethora of great moments to enjoy across these 7 episodes, chiefly with the existing cast of Beelzebub and Rao, and especially with how they interact with Muniel. Their characterization and the nuances found within it are maintained to perfection, and a lot of their dialogue could honestly have been written by Toriyama himself if I didn't know better. Another aspect that I think keeps this arc from falling apart is just how different its focus is. While the core structure remains the same in that there's a political angle going on with a main character tied into it through events of the past, the story puts all the emphasis on Beelzebub this time instead. It results in a story that's a lot more grand given Beelzebub's crazy demon powers and the villain being a literal angel. The fights are bigger, the scale is bigger, it's all bigger. As the story unfolds, it's revealed that Muniel and his army plan on essentially nuking Sandland with their floating fortress that makes Zeus look like a toy in comparison. It gets so grand, in fact, that Muniel rolls up to the demon village and Mafubaz Satan himself into the urn. By the time episode 11 and 12 rolls around, it's effectively Beelzebub and the gang alone trying to stop a literal nuclear holocaust. It's a lot to take in, and I'm not going to pretend it's not at least entertaining to kick back and watch. But hands on the table, honestly, I think it's too much. So much of what made Sandland work as a story for me was its small, down-to-earth scope. Yes, you had demons, but the world was small. The scope tiny enough that a final battle boiled down to a kid and a bug whacking on each other for a while. Its charm and finesse stemmed from the minutiae rather than the large action set pieces. After all, it's the kind of story Toriyama likes to tell. But with this arc, almost all of that is gone. The characters are still themselves and still plenty irreverent to the madness around them, but the world they inhabit feels fundamentally different. It's no longer Akira Toriyama's Sandland, and by his own self-admittance, it's not something he'd have personally written. And while something like the original Bardock special was likewise not a tale Toriyama said he would personally write, I think the core difference is that that story remains simple in spite of its dramatic plot presentation. However, I think I may have actually cracked what this anime arc is. Functionally, it is not an extension of the existing anime or the original story. It is actually a video game! No, I'm actually serious. So much of this arc is actually structured just like a video game. You have the tutorial fight with Muniel, the stealth level trying to stop the execution that then turns into a mid-game rematch with the boss, a set-piece level where you use the Geji Dragon to get your trusty vehicle into the floating fortress, and then video game boss fights that both Rao and Beelzebub take part in. Bread rolls up in final boss mech suit to square up with Rao, and Beelzebub takes on a full-power Muniel in a final fight that even results in a surprise second phase transformation. All the while, Anne restores power to the plummeting ship by walking up the control panel and actually pressing X on the controller. The whole thing is honestly a video game. Beelzebub is such a big fan of Dragon Quest apparently that he steals the move Kaklang. I'm not crazy, you're crazy. In all seriousness though, what that means is that structurally this did not work as a TV series arc. It simply got too big too quickly, and its characters and side plots truly struggled for adequate screen time. It's an aspect I am genuinely curious to see if the video game can alleviate because, believe me, I loved the foundation here. This is by no means a bad arc, especially not at its core. Muniel is a great, fun, and perfect inverse of Beelzebub. I mean, it's hard not to love the interplay of a little angel shithead and a little devil shithead in any form. I would pay good money just to shove the two of them into a room for an episode and let them go at it. This attempt at a sequel could have been better, but I don't begrudge it for existing at all. For a story like Sandland that's so character focused, it's vital to truly understand how to write for those characters, and this really never put a foot wrong in that regard. And well, that's a whole lot more than I can say of other anime revival stories. Whew, and with that, we have reached the end of our journey across the dunes of Sandland. Well, okay, almost everything. I will leave it to you guys to tell me the wonders of the Sandland video game and how you think its version of this sequel story stands up against the anime's version. Yes, sorry, you have to commit to the 30-hour RPG. Do I look like I can review video games? Cut me some slack, I haven't played any in years. While the anime was definitely a bit rocky, I cannot emphasize how much of a blast I had going through all three incarnations of this world. The manga in particular is an absolutely breezy read that provides so much insight into exactly who Toriyama was as a writer and artist. And the movie did its absolute damnedest to bring that very story and world to the big screen for all to see. It feels weird titling a video like this, knowing that with Toriyama now passed, there can never be another series where Toriyama once again tackles the question of what now? That the number of Toriyama penned stories in the world is now forever finite. But at the very least, I am glad I got to experience this story he told. His last hurrah in manga form for such a long time. And you know what? It makes me all the more excited to watch Dragon Ball Daima once it releases. His seeming last hurrah in anime form. I, for one, can't wait to see the results. But until then, I've been Totally Not Mark, and I will see you all next time.